Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the darkest corners of medieval motherhood, where royal nurseries became crime scenes and lullabies turned into death sentences. Picture this. It's a cold December evening in Constantinople, 797 AD. The marble floors of the great palace echo with the soft shuffle of silk slippers as servants hurry through candlelit corridors. Behind gilded doors, a 50-year-old woman sits in perfect stillness, her jeweled fingers drumming against the armrest of her throne. This is Empress Irene, and tonight she's about to make a decision that will horrify the medieval world and earn her a place in history's most twisted maternal hall of fame. So if you are into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The story of Irene begins not with violence, but with an arranged marriage that seemed almost fairy tale perfect. Born around 752 AD in Athens, Irene Sarantapania was selected as a bride for Crown Prince Leo IV through what historians call a medieval beauty contest, though we might charitably assume intelligence and political connections played their part too. The young woman arrived in Constantinople in 769, stepping into a world where purple silk meant everything, and where the wrong political move could mean exile, blindness, or death. Her marriage to Leo IV initially appeared blessed by both fortune and fertility. Leo was known for his military prowess and his continuation of the iconoclastic policies that had defined Byzantine politics for decades. Iconoclasm, more systematic destruction of religious images, had torn the empire apart since 726 AD, creating deep rifts between those who saw icons as idolatrous and those who viewed them as sacred windows to the divine. Irene, raised in the icon-friendly atmosphere of Athens, found herself married into the very family that had launched this religious revolution. In 771, Irene gave birth to Constantine VI, securing the imperial succession and her own position within the purple-born hierarchy. But royal motherhood in Byzantium came with unique challenges that would test even the most devoted parent. The child wasn't just her son, he was the future Basileus, the earthly representative of Christ himself, and every decision about his upbringing carried implications that could reshape the empire. Leo IV's sudden death in 780 changed everything. Constantine VI was only 9 years old, far too young to rule an empire that stretched from Sicily to the Caucasus Mountains. A good to Byzantine law and custom, Irene would serve as regent until her son came of age, but the reality of medieval politics meant that regencies were temporary positions, stepping stones rather than destinations. Most regent mothers gracefully stepped aside when their sons reached maturity, content to enjoy the comfortable retirement that came with being the mother of an emperor. Irene had other plans. As regent, she immediately began dismantling her late husband's iconoclastic policies, calling the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 to restore the veneration of icons. This wasn't merely a religious decision. It was a calculated political move that aligned her with powerful monastic communities and icon-supporting nobles who had been marginalized for decades. But more importantly, it established her as an independent political force, rather than simply the guardian of her son's throne. The empress demonstrated a ruthless pragmatism that would have impressed Machiavelli centuries before he was born. She systematically removed potential threats to her power, exiling or imprisoning nobles who showed too much loyalty to the old iconoclastic policies. When military commanders grumbled about taking orders from a woman, she replaced them with officers who owed their positions entirely to her patronage by the time Constantine VI reached his teens, and courtiers who answered first to his mother, not to him. The tension between mother and son began to simmer around 790. When Constantine VI was 19 and increasingly resentful of his mother's continued dominance, Byzantine sources describe heated arguments behind palace doors, with the young emperor demanding real authority and Irene deflecting with maternal concern. Constantine's first major act of rebellion came in 792 when he attempted to divorce his wife, Maria of Amnia, to marry his mistress Theodote. The marriage had been arranged by Irene, and Constantine's desire to break it represented more than romantic passion, was a direct challenge to his mother's authority over imperial policy. Irene initially refused to sanction the divorce, leading to what Byzantine chroniclers describe as great discord between mother and son. The young emperor's frustration boiled over into open defiance. He began holding court sessions without consulting Irene, issued imperial decrees in his own name, and started building relationships with military commanders who had served his father. For a brief moment, it seemed like the natural transition from regency to independent rule might occur, albeit with more family drama than usual. But Irene had not spent 12 years accumulating power just to hand it over to a headstrong 20-year-old, even if that 20-year-old happened to be her own son. The Empress began to spin a web that would ultimately trap Constantine in a fate worse than death. A fate that would transform her from protective mother into history's most notorious example of maternal ambition gone horribly wrong. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock the medieval world and establish a precedent for royal matricide that would echo through the corridors of power for centuries to come. In the candlelit chambers of the great palace, as winter winds howled off the Bosphorus, a mother prepared to choose empire over offspring, demonstrating that when crown and child come into conflict, even the most fundamental bonds of nature can snap under the weight of imperial ambition. The breaking point came in 797, when Constantine VI made the fatal mistake of underestimating his mother's capacity for ruthlessness. The young emperor had grown increasingly bold in his defiance, surrounding himself with advisors who whispered that 26 was far too old to remain under maternal supervision. What Constantine failed to understand was that Irene had spent 17 years transforming from regent to Alager and all. The Empress moved with the calculated precision of a chess master executing a long-planned endgame furch. She systematically isolated Constantine from his remaining supporters, using a combination of bribes, threats, and promises of future advancement to peel away his inner circle. The logothete John, who had served as Constantine's chief administrator, suddenly found himself transferred to a distant province after Irene discovered correspondence, suggesting proms to limit her influence. General Staurakios, who had once seemed sympathetic to the young emperor's desire for independence, was quietly reminded that his own family's safety depended on maintaining proper respect for the Empress. Irene understood that successful coups required more than just eliminating the target. The Gay demanded creating a narrative that justified the elimination. She began spreading carefully crafted rumors about Constantine's incompetence, suggesting that his military campaigns had been poorly planned and that his domestic policies showed dangerous instability. Byzantine court gossip, always a powerful political weapon, suddenly buzzed with stories of the emperor's supposed erratic behavior and questionable judgment. The whisper campaign proved devastatingly effective. Constantine had indeed struggled with military leadership, suffering defeats against the Bulgars that had cost the empire both territory and prestige. His personal life provided additional ammunition. His divorce and remarriage had scandalized the more conservative elements of the court, and his relationship with Theodote was seen as evidence of weakness rather than romantic passion. By late 796, Irene had successfully painted her son as an unfit ruler whose continued reign threatened the empire's stability. The final phase of her plan required precise timing and absolute commitment. On the 15th of July 797, Constantine VI was returning from a military expedition against the Arabs when he received word that his mother had fallen gravely ill and requested his immediate presence. Medieval sources suggest the emperor hesitated, perhaps sensing that something felt wrong about the summons, but filial duty ultimately overcame political caution. He arrived at the great palace to find not a dying mother, but a carefully orchestrated trap. Irene's loyal guards, led by the logothete Staurakios, were waiting in the imperial apartments. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Constantine VI was seized, bound, and dragged to the same purple-walled chamber where he had been born 26 years earlier. What happened next represents one of the most shocking acts of maternal cruelty in recorded history. Byzantine law recognized several traditional methods for removing imperial threats. Exile, imprisonment, forced monastic vows. Though Irene chose a punishment that was both permanent, blinding, was reserved for the most serious crimes against the imperial person. A sentence that rendered the victim permanently unable to rule while keeping them alive as a living reminder of imperial justice. The irony was devastating. The woman who had given Constantine VI the gift of sight now prepared to take it away forever. The actual blinding took place in the Purple Chamber, the same room where purple-born emperors traditionally entered the world. Medieval accounts describe the procedure with clinical detachment that somehow makes it even more horrifying. Hot irons were used to destroy Constantine's eyes, a process that was both agonizing and irreversible. The chronicler, Theophanes, writing shortly after the event, notes that the sun was darkened for 17 days following the blinding, either remarkable coincidence or medieval commentary on the cosmic significance of such maternal cruelty. What makes Irene's decision even more chilling is the evidence that she personally supervised the procedure. This wasn't a case of overzealous subordinates exceeding their authority, or a mother reluctantly ratifying a decision made by others. Byzantine sources consistently indicate that Irene was present, watching as her son's sight was systematically destroyed, ensuring that the job was completed thoroughly enough to eliminate any possibility of future political implications. The aftermath reveals the calculated nature of her actions. Combined Viite didn't die immediately from his injuries, so lingered for several months, blind and broken, kept alive in imperial apartments that had become his prison. Some historians suggest this prolonged survival was intentional, designed to demonstrate that Irene's actions. She could claim to have shown mercy by sparing his life, even while ensuring his political death. The blinded former emperor became a living ghost, haunting the palace corridors, a constant reminder of what happened to those who challenged Irene's authority. Visitors reported seeing him being led by servants through the same halls where he had once held court, his empty eye sockets serving as a grotesque warning about the price of filial rebellion. The psychological impact on Irene herself remains one of history's great mysteries. Did she feel remorse for destroying her own child, or had years of imperial politics so thoroughly corrupted her maternal instincts that Constantine had become nothing more than a political obstacle to be eliminated? Contemporary accounts consolidate her position as sole ruler. Within days of the blinding, Irene had proclaimed herself Basileus, using the masculine form of the imperial title to emphasize her claim to complete imperial authority. This linguistic choice was revolutionary in itself, as no woman had ever before claimed the full imperial title in Byzantine history. The decision to blind Constantine VI, rather than simply deposing him, reveals the depth of Irene's political calculation. A deposed emperor could potentially be restored to power if political circumstances changed. But a blinded emperor was permanently neutralized. By choosing the most extreme option available, she demonstrated that her commitment to retaining power exceeded even the most fundamental bonds of motherhood. The precedent she established would echo through medieval history, providing a template for future royal mothers who faced similar conflicts between family loyalty. While Irene's Byzantine horror story was unfolding in Constantinople, the Frankish kingdoms to the west were witnessing their own maternal nightmare, orchestrated by a queen whose name would become synonymous with medieval political ruthlessness. Brunhild of Austrasia makes Irene look almost restrained by comparison. Where the Byzantine Empress destroyed one son, this Visigothic princess turned Frankish queen would orchestrate the deaths, mock royal children, into make Game of Thrones seem like a children's bedtime story. Born around 543, added as a Visigothic princess in Spain, Brunhild arrived in the Frankish court as part of a diplomatic marriage that was supposed to bring peace between the warring Germanic kingdoms. She married King Sigebert I of Austrasia in 567, becoming queen of one of the most powerful Frankish realms and stepping into a political landscape. The Merovingian dynasty had a well-established tradition of solving succession disputes through creative violence, and Brunhild would prove herself a remarkably quick study in these family traditions. Her transformation from diplomatic bride to child killing Queen Mother began with a tragedy that would define the rest of her 60-year reign. In 575, King Sigebert was assassinated on the orders of Queen Fredegund of the woman who would become her lifelong nemesis. The murder left Brunhild widowed with a 5-year-old son, Childebert II, who inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies, and a mother whose grief would slowly curdle into something far more dangerous than simple revenge. Brunhild appeared to be following the traditional path of the devoted regent mother, protecting her young son's inheritance and carefully managing the kingdom's affairs until he came of age. She demonstrated considerable political skill, forming alliances with Burgundian nobles and maintaining Austrasia's independence, despite pressure from neighboring kingdom. Contemporary sources describe her as intelligent, beautiful, and remarkably well-educated for a woman of her era. She could read Latin, understood complex theological debates, and maintained correspondence with Pope Gregory the Great himself. But beneath this veneer of maternal dedication and political competence, something darker was taking root. The death of Childebert II in 596 should have marked the end of Brunhild's formal political power, as her son left behind 2 young sons who would inherit the kingdom under new regencies. Instead, it became the beginning of her most destructive phase as the former Queen Mother maneuvered herself into the position of grandmother regent and began treating her grandsons not a beloved Manalphanage. Theudebert T and Theuderic T, Brunhild's grandsons, initially benefited from their grandmother's political experience and ruthless determination to maintain family power. She helped them navigate the complex web of Frankish politics, arranged advantageous marriages, and used her extensive network of noble allies to strengthen their position. But as the boys grew into young men with opinions and ambitions of their own, Brunhild began to see them as threats rather than heirs. The first sign of trouble came when Theudebert, ruling in Austrasia, began making independent decisions without consulting his grandmother. He formed an alliance with the Lombards that Brunhild opposed, married a woman she hadn't selected, and started surrounding himself with advisors who owed their loyalty to him rather than to her. In most families, this would have been seen as natural maturation, a young king growing into his role and establishing his independence. For Brunhild, it represented an intolerable challenge to the power structure she had spent decades building. Using her influence with Theuderic, she convinced the younger grandson that his older brother was plotting against him, transforming sibling rivalry into outright warfare. The brothers who had grown up together in Brunhild's care were soon leading armies against each other, each convinced that family survival depended on eliminating the other. This wasn't simply a case of political manipulation gone wrong. Surviving documents suggest that Brunhild actively encouraged the conflict, providing military support to whichever grandson seemed more likely to eliminate his brother. The fratricidal war that followed devastated both kingdoms and left thousands of Frankish warriors dead in battles that served no purpose except to satisfy one old woman's need to remain the ultimate authority in her family's affairs. Theudebert died in 612, officially killed in battle against his brother's forces, though some contemporary chronicles hint at poison. Suspicion that gains credibility when placed in the context of Brunhild's later action. With one grandson eliminated, she might have been expected to focus her energies on supporting the survivor, but Theuderic soon discovered that victory hadn't bought him freedom from his grandmother's control. When he began showing signs of independent thinking, similar to his dead brother, Brunhild's solution was characteristically direct. In 613, Theuderic died suddenly under mysterious circumstances while preparing for a campaign against Neustria. He was only 26 years old and had been in apparent good health, leading many historians to suspect poison administered on his grandmother's orders. The official cause of death was given as dysentery, but medieval dysentery rarely struck so quickly or conveniently, and the timing, just as Theuderic was beginning to assert real independence, seems rhyming, just as Theuderic was beginning to assert really independence. With both grandsons dead, Brunhild found herself ruling through Theuderic's infant sons, her great-grandsons, who were far too young to pose any threat to her authority. But her reign, as the power behind multiple thrones, was about to come to a spectacularly violent end. Courtesy of the same Queen Fredegund, whose assassination of Brunhild's husband had started this entire cycle of vengeance nearly 4 decades earlier, the final act of Brunhild's story would prove that medieval justice, while slow, could be remarkably thorough when it finally arrived. Her death in 613 would be so brutal that it shocked even an age accustomed to creative violence, serving as a grim reminder that those who live by familial betrayal often die by it as well. But before that reckoning arrived, Brunhild had established a template for royal grandmothers who valued power over blood, demonstrating that maternal love could be weaponized in ways that would make traditional warriors seem almost gentle by comparison. The Visigothic kingdoms of Iberia were producing their own maternal monsters during the same blood-soaked period, and Queen Gwaswintha's story reads like a masterclass in how stepmotherhood could become a vehicle for systematic child murder. Where Irene had targeted one son and Brunhild had orchestrated the deaths of grandsons, Gwaswintha would demonstrate that when it came to eliminating Inconfolion, stepchildren, grandchildren, and even her own daughter's infants would all fall victim to her relentless pursuit of dynasty. Gwaswintha's path to power began through the traditional route of strategic marriage, but her story quickly diverged into territory that would make even hardened medieval chroniclers reach for their strongest wine. Born into Visigothic nobility around 548, she first married King Ælfthryth, becoming queen of a kingdom that stretched across most of modern Spain and southern France. This initial marriage was relatively conventional by royal standards: political alliance, production of heirs, the usual blend of diplomacy and dynasty building that characterized medieval royal union. But Ælfthryth's death in 567 left Gwaswintha as a widow with considerable political experience and absolutely no intention of retiring gracefully to a convent. Medieval widowed queens typically faced limited options: remarriage to cement political alliances, retirement to religious life, or serving as regents for their children. Gwaswintha chose a fourth option that wasn't technically available. She would remarry not just for alliance, but for the specific purpose of gaining access to someone else's children, whom she could then systematically eliminate to clear the path for her own bloodline's advancement. Her target was King Leovigild of the Visigoths, a widower with 2 sons from his previous marriage, Hermegild and Rekard. To the casual observer, this seemed like a sensible political match, two experienced rulers combining their resources and legitimacy to strengthen the Visigothic kingdom. What they couldn't have anticipated was that Gwaswintha viewed her new stepsons not as family members to be protected and guided, but as obstacles to be removed through whatever means proved most efficient. The transformation from stepmother to step. Gwaswintha started by attempting to convert Hermegild and Rekard from Arian Christianity to Catholicism, a religious shift that would have aligned them with her own theological preferences and potentially made them more malleable to her influence. When the boys resisted, hardly surprising, given that religious conversion in the medieval period was often a prelude to political submission, she escalated to more direct forms of persuasion. Contemporary accounts describe beatings, imprisonment in palace chambers, and the systematic removal of servants and tutors who showed too much loyalty to the princes. Hermenegild's rebellion in 579 gave Gwaswintha the excuse. She had been waiting for. The prince had married Ingund, a Frankish Catholic princess, and declared independence in the southern part of the kingdom, rejecting both his father's Arian faith and Gwaswintha's authority. Most stepmothers might have seen this as a family crisis requiring diplomatic resolution, but Gwaswintha recognized it as an opportunity for permanent solution to her stepson problem. She convinced Leovigild that Hermegild's rebellion threatened not just their marriage, but the entire kingdom's stability. The resulting civil war lasted 5 years and ended with Hermegild's capture and execution in 584, officially ordered by his father, but Orgishu in 584. With one stepson eliminated, Gwaswintha turned her attention to Rekard. But here she encountered unexpected resistance. The surviving prince had learned from his brother's fate and began building his own network of supporters who were specifically chosen for their independence from his stepmother's influence. He also demonstrated a talent for political survival that matched Gwaswintha's own, carefully avoiding the kind of open rebellion that had doomed Hermenegild, while quietly preparing for the day when he would inherit the throne. Frustrated by her inability to eliminate Rekard through the same methods that had worked with his brother, Gwaswintha began exploring more creative approaches to dynastic management. If she couldn't kill the stepson directly, she would focus on preventing him from producing heirs, while simultaneously option for royal succession. This strategy led to one of the most horrifying episodes in her already blood-soaked career, when her daughter Brunhild, yes, the same Brunhild who was simultaneously terrorizing the Frankish kingdoms, gave birth to children who could potentially complicate Visigothic succession claims. Gwaswintha made a decision that shocked, even by medieval standards. She traveled to the Frankish court under the pretense of visiting her daughter and new grandchildren, but her real purpose was far more sinister. Contemporary Frankish sources describe her systematically poisoning several of Brunhild's infant children, eliminating potential claimants to Visigothic inheritance before they were old enough to pose any real threat. The murders were carried out with such subtlety that they initially appeared to be natural infant mortality, tragically common occurrence in the medieval period. But the timing and the pattern eventually aroused suspicion, especially when servants began reporting that the babies' deaths consistently followed visits from their loving grandmother. By the time Brunhild really eliminated 3 of her grandchildren and was preparing to target more, the confrontation between mother and daughter that followed represents one of the few recorded instances of Gwaswintha showing anything resembling emotional response to her actions. According to Frankish chronicles, she justified the murders by explaining that royal bloodlines required careful management and that too many competing claimants would inevitably lead to civil wars that would destroy both kingdoms. In her mind, she was being a responsible grandmother, preventing future conflict by eliminating potential sources of dynastic instability before they could mature into actual threats. This rationalization reveals the fundamental corruption of maternal instinct that characterized all these medieval queen murderers. They had convinced themselves that their actions served the greater good of dynastic stability, transforming infanticide as the monstrous prey of family bonds that it actually represented. Gwaswintha's reign of terror finally ended in 589. Not through external justice, but through the kind of poetic irony that medieval chroniclers loved to record. Rekard, the stepson who had survived her decades of attempted elimination, finally inherited the throne and immediately began investigating the suspicious deaths that had plagued the royal family during his stepmother's influence. The evidence he uncovered was so overwhelming that even the normally forgiving medieval church condemned Gwaswintha as an unnatural mother whose crimes exceeded the bounds of political necessity. Her death was remarkably unremarkable. She simply died in her sleep, apparently of natural causes, leaving behind a legacy of murdered children, and a stepson who spent his reign trying to rebuild the family structures she had systematically destroyed. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England were simultaneously producing their own version of murderous motherhood. Though Queen Ælfthryth's approach to eliminating inconvenient royal children would prove more sophisticated and ultimately more successful than her continental counterparts, where Irene had relied on brutal force, Brunhild on manipulation, and Ælfthryth on systematic poisoning, Ælfthryth would demonstrate that the most effective child-killing queens were those who understood how to make murder look like accident-defying judgment. Her story represents the culmination of everything we've witnessed, a perfect synthesis of maternal ambition and royal ruthlessness that would reshape English kingship and establish precedents that would echo through the centuries. Ælfthryth entered the Anglo-Saxon royal scene through a marriage that seemed almost boringly conventional compared to the dramatic unions we've encountered elsewhere. She became the second wife of King Edgar the Peaceful in 964, joining a court that was relatively stable by medieval standards and a kingdom that had experienced unprecedented prosperity under Edgar's rule. Her new husband already had a son, Edward, from his previous marriage, but this seemed like a minor complication rather than the kind of existential threat that had driven other queens to infanticide. Edward was a teenager when Ælfthryth married his father, old enough to have his own household, but young enough that a clever stepmother could still influence his development and potentially forge a genuine family bond. The birth of Ælfthryth's son, Ælfthryth in 968, should have completed what looked like a successful royal family unit. Edgar had his heir, and his spare Ælfthryth had secured her position through motherhood, and the kingdom had dynastic stem Ælfthryth. But appearances in medieval politics were often more dangerous than open hostility, and Ælfthryth's apparent contentment masked the same calculating ambition that had driven her predecessors to their monstrous act. The critical moment came with Edgar's unexpected death in 975, when Edward was around 13 and Ælfthryth was merely 7 years old. According to Anglo-Saxon law and custom, Edward should have inherited automatically as the eldest son, with Ælfthryth serving as his stepmother and advisor rather than as regent. This represented exactly the kind of political diminishment that had triggered murderous responses in other royal mothers, and Ælfthryth's reaction would prove that she had been studying their methods carefully. Her initial approach was brilliantly subtle, focusing on undermining Edward's reputation and competence rather than attempting direct elimination. She began spreading carefully crafted doubts about the young king's legitimacy, suggesting that his mother's marriage to Edgar might not have been properly solemnized according to church law. These weren't wild accusations and many-faceted legal arguments that exploited genuine ambiguities to justify political opposition. Simultaneously, she positioned herself as the concerned stepmother, worried about Edward's apparent instability and poor judgment. Contemporary sources describe her expressing maternal concern about his drinking, his association with unsuitable companions, and his failure to demonstrate the kind of mature leadership that the kingdom required. The genius of this approach was that it made her seem reasonable and responsible, while painting Edward as unfit for kingship through his own failings rather than through any action. The murder of Edward the Martyr in 978 represents the masterpiece of medieval royal assassination, child-killing so perfectly orchestrated that historians still debate whether it was actually murder or simply a tragic accident that happened to benefit Ælfthryth's ambitions. The official version of events has Edward visiting his stepmother and half-brother at Corfe Castle, where he was offered hospitality and refreshments before continuing his journey. While drinking from a cup provided by Ælfthryth's servants, he was allegedly attacked by unknown assailants who stabbed him while he remained mounted on his horse. He died almost immediately, and his killers disappeared into the countryside without being identified or captured. This story contains just enough plausible detail to seem credible while featuring enough convenient coincidences to arouse suspicion. Edward happened to die at exactly the location where his stepmother was residing, at exactly the moment when his death would most benefit her son's political prospects, killed by assassins who were never found, despite extensive searches. Medieval chroniclers immediately began speculating about Ælfthryth's involvement, but their suspicions were based more on timing and motive than on concrete evidence. The brilliance of the assassination lay in its apparent spontaneity. Unlike the elaborate torture sessions orchestrated by Irene or the systematic poisoning campaigns conducted by Ælfthryth, Edward's death looked like the kind of random violence that plagued medieval travel. Ælfthryth's behavior following the murder was equally masterful, displaying exactly the right mixture of grief, shock, and concern for the kingdom's stability. she publicly mourned her stepson's death, arranged for his burial with full royal honours, and expressed appropriate horror at the violence that had claimed such a promising young king. Most importantly, she demonstrated reluctance about her own son's succession, suggesting that 7-year-old Ælfthryth might be too young for kingship, and offering to support alternative candidates if the nobility preferred them. This apparent selflessness was calculated to disarm suspicion, while simultaneously establishing her as the obvious choice for regent. Once Ælfthryth's succession was confirmed, the transformation of Edward from murdered stepson to martyred saint represents Ælfthryth's final masterstroke. Rather than attempting to suppress the growing cult that developed around Edward's tomb, she actively encouraged it, positioning his half-brother toward worthy kingship. She sponsored the construction of shrines, supported the recording of miracles associated with Edward's relics, and even participated in religious ceremonies celebrating his sanctity. This strategy served multiple purposes. C. deflected suspicion about her involvement in his death, demonstrated her piety and devotion to family, and created a narrative in which Edward's death was part of divine providence, rather than human scheming. By transforming her victim into a saint, she made questioning his death seem almost blasphemous, effectively immunizing herself against accusations while maintaining her grip on power through her son's regency. The long-term success of Ælfthryth's approach becomes clear when we consider the aftermath of her action. Ælfthryth ruled for 38 years, one of the longest reigns in Anglo-Saxon history, and his mother remained influential throughout his kingship. Unlike the other queens we've encountered, who either died violently or saw their dynasties collapse within a generation, Ælfthryth lived to see her son establish himself as a major English king and her grandchildren inherit legitimate claims to the throne. Her methods have been more patient and sophisticated than those of her predecessors, but the fundamental calculation remained the same: the elimination of inconvenient children in service of dynastic advancement. The precedent she established would influence English royal politics for centuries, demonstrating based face-for royal murders were those that looked least like murders. Third queens would study her techniques, learning that subtlety and patience were more effective than dramatic violence when it came to eliminating. As we've seen throughout this journey into medieval maternal monstrosity, the queens who murdered their own children shared certain fundamental characteristics that transcended cultural and geographic boundaries. They were all intelligent, politically sophisticated women who had tasted power and found themselves unwilling to relinquish it when biological and legal conventions demanded they step aside. They understood that in medieval politics, sentiment was a luxury that could cost everything, and they were prepared to sacrifice the most fundamental human bonds in service of what they saw as higher political necessities. But perhaps most chillingly, they all found ways to rationalize their actions, convincing themselves that their murders served the greater good of dynastic stability and kingdom welfare. They became living examples of how power corrupts, not just through greed or ambition, but through the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that eventually allows the unthinkable to seem not just possible but necessary. These weren't monsters born evil, but mothers who allowed political calculation to slowly replace mater until they found themselves capable of destroying the very children they had once sworn to protect. In the end, their stories serve as timeless reminders that power's greatest danger lies not in its ability to corrupt the weak, but in its capacity to transform natural love into calculated cruelty, making monsters out of mothers and turning nurseries into crime scenes where the most innocent victims fall to the most trusted hands. The medieval world produced many forms of cruelty, but few as deeply disturbing as the sight of royal mothers choosing crowns over children, demonstrating that when power and parenthood collide, even the most sacred bonds can shatter under the weight of imperial ambition. Well knowing that modern mothers face different challenges, gentler times, and legal systems that protect children from those who should love them most. The purple chambers are empty now, their terrible secrets preserved only in dusty chronicles and whispered warnings about the price of absolute power rates. Easy in your beds tonight, far from the marble halls where lullabies once masked the sound of daggers being sharpened and poison being prepared by hands that had once cradled the very children they would ultimately destroy.